The aroma of Sunday roast typically wafted from the house on Miller Drive, a familiar comfort in the quiet suburban sprawl of Alpharetta, Georgia. But on the afternoon of July 17th, it was the acrid smell of smoke that settled over the neighborhood, a dense, choking pall that erased the familiar comfort of summer air. The fire, which began shortly after 4:00 p.m., quickly engulfed the two-story colonial home, a structure previously known for its meticulous upkeep and welcoming facade. Flames tore through the roof, sending embers spiraling high into the clear sky, visible for miles across the northern Atlanta suburbs. Neighbors, drawn by the sirens and the sudden intense heat, gathered on their lawns, their faces illuminated by the eerie orange glow, their expressions a mix of shock and morbid fascination. This was the home of Pastor Arthur Vance, a respected figure in the community and a spiritual leader at the non-denominational Grace Harbor Church. Firefighting units from Alpharetta Department of Public Safety were on the scene within minutes, their hoses unleashing torrents of water onto the inferno. The battle against the blaze was intense, lasting over 2 hours before the structure was deemed largely under control, albeit irrevocably damaged. What remained was a skeletal framework of charred timber and a pervasive scent of destruction. The yellow crime tape, stretched taut across the perimeter, became an immediate, stark boundary separating the scene of devastation from the still green lawns of adjacent properties. The street, usually quiet and filled with children's laughter, was now dominated by the heavy machinery of emergency services and the somber silence of onlookers. The immediate concern was for the residents. Pastor Vance and his wife Martha were reportedly not home at the time of the fire, having been at a church elders meeting. Their son, Daniel Vance, and his wife Sarah, who lived nearby, were also accounted for, though Daniel arrived at the scene visibly distressed, his face ashen, his gaze fixed on the smoldering ruins. The initial assessment by Fire Marshal Gregory Hayes pointed quickly towards a suspicious origin. The speed and intensity with which the fire consumed the structure suggested the use of accelerants, a detail immediately noted by the seasoned investigators. The burn patterns, though obscured by the extensive damage, indicated multiple points of origin, a hallmark of deliberately set fires. The Vances, pillars of their community, seemed an unlikely target for such an act of malice. Pastor Arthur Vance, a man in his late 50s with a calm demeanor and a gentle voice, had served Grace Harbor Church for over 2 decades. Martha Vance, equally beloved, was known for her charitable work and warm hospitality. The idea that their home could be the target of an intentional act of destruction sent ripples of unease through the close-knit neighborhood. As the last tendrils of smoke drifted into the twilight, the methodical work of the investigation began. The scene was secured overnight, ensuring no further disturbance to potential evidence. The early hours of July 18th saw the arrival of specialized arson investigators, their equipment laid out methodically around the perimeter of the destroyed home. Their task was to meticulously sift through the debris, brick by brick, piece by piece, searching for any trace of what had caused this devastation. Every fragment of charred wood, every twisted piece of metal, held a potential clue. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash and chemicals, a constant reminder of the violence that had unfolded here. The mail still sat undisturbed in the mailbox, a stark contrast to the destruction behind it, a quiet testament to a life violently disrupted. This early observation suggested the family had left without anticipating such an immediate and cataclysmic event. The investigative team began by establishing a comprehensive timeline, speaking with neighbors, first responders, and anyone who had witnessed the initial moments of the fire. Their statements consistently described a rapid escalation of flames, contradicting the typical progression of an accidental electrical fire or kitchen mishap. One neighbor, Miss Eleanor Finch, who lived directly across the street, recalled a sudden loud crack, followed almost immediately by a visible burst of fire from the side of the house. It was instant, she recounted to investigators, her voice still trembling days later. Not like anything I've seen before, just boom, and then flames everywhere. This detail further solidified the investigators' suspicions of an incendiary device or substance. The focus shifted from merely documenting the damage to actively seeking evidence of criminal intent. The initial shock began to give way to a grim determination within law enforcement. The destruction of the Vance home was not merely a material loss. It was a profound violation of a community's sense of security. The immediate questions revolved around who could harbor such ill will towards the respected pastor and his family. The police department initiated broader inquiries, looking into any possible disputes, grievances, or threats that Pastor Vance or his family might have faced. However, early interviews with church members, colleagues, and acquaintances painted a picture of a man universally admired, devoid of known enemies. This absence of external motive pushed the investigators to consider more internal, perhaps hidden, dynamics within the Vance family or their immediate circle. The initial phase of the investigation was slow, methodical, and deliberately broad, refusing to narrow focus until compelling evidence emerged. Daniel Vance, the pastor's only son, became a peripheral but important figure in these early interviews. He was a landscape architect, 32 years old, married to Sarah for 5 years. He was visibly distraught at the scene of the fire, weeping openly as he surveyed the damage. His initial statement to police offered little direct information, mostly expressing shock and confusion. He affirmed his alibi. He had been with Sarah at their own home, several miles away, preparing dinner. Yet, a subtle unease lingered in the interactions with Daniel. His grief, while genuine, seemed tinged with an almost detached quality, a quiet intensity that caught the attention of the interviewing officers. This observation was noted, filed, and would be revisited later as the investigation progressed. The meticulous recording of these small details proved crucial in building a comprehensive picture of the incident. As the physical evidence was carefully processed, the arson investigation team, led by Detective Mark Jensen from the Alpharetta Police Department, began to confirm their initial suspicions. Samples of debris from various locations within the burned structure, particularly from the living room and the master bedroom, tested positive for ignitable liquids. Gas chromatography mass spectrometry, a precise forensic technique, identified gasoline as the primary accelerant. This finding transformed the case from a tragic accident into a confirmed act of arson, a violent felony. The discovery of gasoline residue provided a tangible link to human intent, shifting the narrative from a disaster to a crime. The yellow crime tape, previously a boundary for a tragedy, now marked the scene of a deliberate act of destruction. The presence of gasoline pointed directly to a premeditated act, rather than an impulsive one. This detail prompted investigators to broaden their surveillance and background checks, focusing not just on external threats but also on individuals within the family's orbit who might have had access or motive. Daniel Vance's earlier distress and the slight incongruity in his demeanor became more prominent in the minds of the detectives. While his alibi held up initially, the sheer volume of accelerant suggested a degree of planning that went beyond simple emotional outburst. The investigation entered a new, more intensive phase, one where every relationship, every interaction within the Vance family, would be meticulously scrutinized for cracks and hidden tensions. The apparent normalcy of the Vance family was beginning to fray under the relentless pressure of forensic inquiry. The physical wreckage of the Vance home stood as a stark monument to the fire, but it was the digital wreckage that began to offer the first true glimpse into the hidden turmoil beneath the family's placid surface. While investigators sifted through ash and a parallel digital forensics unit began examining the electronic devices recovered from the scene. Phones belonging to Pastor Arthur Vance and Martha Vance, and critically, a laptop belonging to Sarah Vance that, though damaged, retained some recoverable data. These devices, once conduits of everyday communication, now held the potential to unravel secrets. The focus remained broad initially, but as the data extraction progressed, patterns began to emerge, particularly concerning communications between Pastor Arthur Vance and his daughter-in-law, Sarah Vance. The seemingly innocuous family interactions masked a more complex, unsettling reality. Early analysis of text messages and email correspondence between Arthur and Sarah revealed a gradual shift in tone over several months. Initially, the exchanges were typical of a father-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship: pleasantries, family updates, church-related discussions. However, by late spring, a subtle intimacy began to creep into the language. Texts became more frequent, often late at night, and included phrases that hinted at a deeper, more personal connection. Digital timestamps and cell tower data confirmed that these communications occurred even when Daniel was reportedly away on business trips or working late. This pattern alone was not conclusive of impropriety, but it was enough to raise a significant red flag for Detective Jensen's team. The quiet suburb of Alpharetta, with its manicured lawns and serene facades, often concealed a turbulent inner world. The investigators approached these findings with caution, understanding the sensitivity of family dynamics. They meticulously cross-referenced call logs and text messages with other known events, such as family gatherings, church services, and individual travel schedules. It became evident that Arthur and Sarah were indeed spending time together outside of family functions, often under the guise of church errands or personal favors. A neighbor, Mr. Thomas Jenkins, who lived 2 houses down from Pastor Vance, recalled seeing Sarah's car parked at the Vance residence several times during weekdays when he knew Daniel was at work. Thought nothing of it at the time, Mr. Jenkins stated in his interview. Figured she was just helping Martha with something, or visiting Arthur about church stuff. They were always so close, like a second daughter to them. His observation, innocent at the time, now took on a more ominous significance. The emotional impact of these unfolding revelations, though still confined to the investigative team, began to cast a grim shadow. The image of the respected pastor, a man who preached fidelity and moral rectitude, was starting to erode. The quiet and observational nature of the investigation allowed for this slow, methodical peeling back of layers. There was no rush to judgment, only a steady pursuit of truth through concrete data. The investigators understood that family secrets, especially those involving infidelity, could be volatile and destructive, capable of igniting intense passions. This underlying tension, now confirmed through digital evidence, offered a compelling, if deeply disturbing, potential motive for the arson. The clean lines of the crime scene were beginning to blur with the messy contours of human betrayal. The retrieved data from Sarah's laptop provided even more direct evidence. Among fragmented files and deleted browsing history, forensic specialists recovered partially composed emails and drafts of messages that were never sent, or had been deleted with intent. These drafts, written by Sarah, contained explicit expressions of affection and longing directed towards Arthur. One particularly damning fragment read, "I know this is wrong, Arthur, but I can't stop thinking about you. Daniel, she doesn't understand." Another referenced secret meetings at a quiet coffee shop in downtown Alpharetta, a small independent establishment known for its discretion. The sheer volume and nature of these recovered communications painted an undeniable picture of an escalating affair, one that had progressed far beyond mere emotional attachment. The confirmation of the affair initiated a new phase in the investigation. Daniel Vance, previously interviewed as a witness, now became a person of interest. The detectives carefully reviewed his initial statements, searching for inconsistencies or veiled admissions. They sought to understand when and how Daniel might have discovered the infidelity. There were no explicit mentions of arguments or threats regarding the affair in the early witness interviews, which suggested Daniel might have kept his knowledge of the betrayal fiercely private. The quiet nature of his observed distress at the fire scene began to seem less like shock and more like a profound internalized anguish. The timeline of his own phone usage and movements became critically important, particularly in the days and hours leading up to the fire. The focus on Daniel deepened, but the investigation remained clinically detached, processing information without succumbing to speculation. It was a methodical reconstruction of events, driven by digital breadcrumbs and subtle shifts in behavior. The investigators realized that the catalyst for the arson was unlikely to have been a direct confrontation at the scene, but rather a slow-burning realization, a profound personal betrayal that had reached its breaking point. The gravity of such an act, committed against one's own father and father's home, underscored the intensity of the emotional fallout. This internal family conflict, hidden from the public eye for months, had finally erupted in a devastating physical manifestation. The once quiet cul-de-sac on Miller Drive had become the stage for a deeply personal and destructive tragedy. The precise moment of discovery by Daniel remained elusive in these initial stages, but the digital trail offered tantalizing clues. While reviewing Daniel's own phone data, investigators found a series of unusually long calls and text exchanges with a friend, Mark Thompson, in the weeks leading up to the fire. These communications, though not explicitly detailing the affair, carried an increasingly urgent and distressed tone. Mark Thompson, when interviewed, recalled Daniel's growing agitation. "He was just off," Thompson told detectives, choosing his words carefully. "He kept saying things were wrong, that his whole world felt upside down. He wouldn't say why, not directly, but I knew something serious was eating at him." This vague but intense emotional distress was a critical piece of the puzzle, suggesting Daniel was grappling with a profound secret. The acceleration in the investigation came not from a dramatic confession, but from a painstaking forensic reconstruction of events preceding the fire. Investigators began to cross-reference Daniel's digital footprint with credit card statements and security camera footage from various locations in Alpharetta. A significant finding emerged. 3 days before the fire, Daniel Vance had made a purchase at a hardware store on Windward Parkway, an establishment that sold fuel cans and various solvents. The surveillance footage from the store clearly showed him purchasing 2 5-gallon gasoline cans and a large empty plastic container. This purchase, initially overlooked amidst other daily transactions, now stood out with chilling clarity. It was a direct, irrefutable link to the primary accelerant found at the scene. This discovery, while not a full confession, provided the critical piece of evidence that pivoted the investigation directly towards Daniel. It was the moment the circumstantial began to solidify into the factual. Detective Jensen immediately sought a warrant for Daniel Vance's arrest, not for arson yet, but for questioning in relation to suspicious activities. The legal framework was meticulously followed, ensuring every step was verifiable and sound. The confrontation, when it came, was not a sudden burst of anger, but a carefully orchestrated interview designed to elicit truth from an increasingly cornered suspect. The emotional core of the case, the betrayal, now had a tangible, procedural consequence. The quiet suburban street of Miller Drive was about to witness another kind of revelation. Daniel was taken into custody on July 20th, 3 days after the fire, at his Alpharetta home. He offered no resistance. His demeanor was strangely subdued, almost resigned, a stark contrast to the initial distress he had displayed at the fire scene. During the initial hours of questioning at the Alpharetta Police Department headquarters, Daniel maintained his alibi, asserting he had been home with Sarah. However, when presented with the evidence of his purchase of gasoline cans, his composure began to crack. His eyes, previously steady, now darted nervously. He swallowed hard, his silence stretching for agonizing minutes before he finally spoke. "It was just for my lawnmower," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The explanation was weak, and the investigators knew it. The quantity purchased far exceeded normal domestic use. The interview continued, a slow, methodical chipping away at Daniel's defenses. The detectives presented him with fragments of the recovered communications between Arthur and Sarah. They did not reveal the full extent of their knowledge, merely hinting at the discovered intimacy. The effect was immediate and devastating. Daniel visibly recoiled, his face blanched. His initial denial regarding the gasoline purchase quickly crumbled. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, burying his face in his hands. The silence in the interrogation room was surgical, broken only by the soft hum of the ventilation system. He was gone. Just like that. The dam had broken. His quiet anguish, previously internalized, began to pour out in a torrent of disjointed phrases and choked sobs. He spoke of betrayal, of a shattered world, of a father he no longer recognized. He recounted the moment he found out. It was 2 weeks before the fire, on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday evening. Sarah had left her personal tablet charging on the kitchen counter, and Daniel, intending to check the weather, had inadvertently opened her message app. What he saw there, a series of intimate exchanges with a contact named Arthur G., immediately froze him. The words, explicit in their affection, left no room for misinterpretation. His blood ran cold. The man on the screen, Arthur G., was his father, Pastor Arthur Vance. The world he had known, built on trust and faith, collapsed around him in that instant. He remembered the feeling of utter disbelief, then a searing, unimaginable pain. He did not confront them immediately. Instead, he retreated into a shell of silence, his mind consumed by the revelation, the betrayal festering within him. He was a son, a husband, a man of faith, raised in a pastor's home. The days that followed were a blur of internal torment for Daniel. He continued his daily routines, going to work, interacting with Sarah and his parents, but everything felt profoundly distorted. He ate, slept, and spoke, but his mind was constantly replaying the words, the images of his father and wife, entangled in a deceitful liaison. He became withdrawn, losing weight, his eyes shadowed with an unexpressed anguish. Friends and colleagues noticed his change but attributed it to stress from his landscaping business. He meticulously planned the fire, the gasoline cans, the specific timing on a Sunday afternoon when he knew his parents would be at a church meeting, the calculated avoidance of any direct confrontation with them. The destructive impulse was not a spontaneous outburst but a deliberate, chilling act of retaliation, a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of his shattered life. He confessed to pouring the gasoline, meticulously soaking the living room and master bedroom, key areas where the affair had likely unfolded or been discussed. He described the cold resolve he felt as he struck the match, the sudden whoosh of flames, the heat that pushed him back, and then the chilling satisfaction of watching the house, the symbol of his family's integrity and his father's moral authority, consumed by fire. He fled the scene, drove aimlessly for hours through the quiet streets of Alpharetta, before returning home to feign surprise and shock when news of the fire reached him. His confession was detailed, unburdened by remorse for the act itself, only by the profound betrayal that had driven him to it. The raw, unfiltered account provided investigators with the full picture of the crime. Rooted in the tragic unraveling of a family, the quiet suburb held its breath. On the afternoon of July 17th, at precisely 4:10 p.m., Daniel Vance ignited the accelerant within his parents' home on Miller Drive. He had ensured the house was empty, a detail he later stressed to investigators, indicating his intent was purely destructive, not homicidal. The fire took hold immediately, feeding on the gasoline-soaked materials, roaring to life with a ferocity that belied the quiet street outside. He had opened a window in the living room to create a draft, ensuring maximum oxygen for the conflagration. The heat was instantaneous, forcing him to retreat rapidly through the back door. As he drove away, he glanced in his rearview mirror, seeing the first plumes of black smoke curling skyward from the roof, a silent testament to his act. The entire sequence, from ignition to his departure, took less than 3 minutes. The physical evidence meticulously collected by the Alpharetta Fire Marshal's office and the GBI crime lab perfectly corroborated Daniel's confession. Samples from the living room floor and the master bedroom yielded definitive traces of gasoline. The burn patterns, though initially challenging to interpret due to the extensive damage, now aligned precisely with Daniel's description of where he had distributed the accelerant. Forensic examination of the remains confirmed the ignition points, validating his account. A slightly singed but intact lighter, found cleverly hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Daniel's own home, provided further corroborating evidence. It was a detail he had forgotten to mention in his confession, but it perfectly matched the type of ignition device he described using. The methodical nature of his planning and execution was chillingly evident. The police had also meticulously reviewed Daniel's movements in the days leading up to the fire. His phone records showed a sudden spike in data usage, related to searches for arson conviction Georgia, fire accelerants easy access, and how to burn down a house without getting caught. These searches, made in the deep hours of the night, painted a picture of a man consumed by a dark, destructive impulse, a man driven to the brink by an unimaginable betrayal. The digital footprint was as damning as the physical evidence. His meticulous planning combined with his detailed confession left little doubt as to his culpability. The prosecution's case was building into an unassailable fortress of evidence, both forensic and circumstantial, that tied Daniel directly to the devastating fire. The silence of the Alpharetta community was broken by the growing hum of legal proceedings. The arrest of Daniel Vance, the pastor's son, sent shockwaves through Alpharetta, a community accustomed to quiet suburban life, not the public unraveling of a prominent family. The story of the fire quickly shifted from a tragic accident to a deeply disturbing act of familial betrayal and retribution. Public sentiment was a complex mixture of sympathy for Martha Vance, shock at Pastor Arthur Vance's transgression, and a grim understanding of Daniel's unimaginable pain, yet also condemnation for his violent response. The case, quickly deemed the pastor's son arson, dominated local news. The initial questioning concluded with Daniel formally charged with arson in the first degree, a felony carrying significant prison sentences. The legal process, slow and deliberate, had begun its inevitable course. The grand jury, presented with the overwhelming forensic evidence in Daniel's confession, returned an indictment for arson in the first degree, sending the case to trial. The trial of Daniel Vance commenced 6 months later, in January of the following year, at the Fulton County Courthouse in downtown Atlanta. The courtroom was packed, drawing not only legal observers but also curious members of the Alpharetta community, including many congregants from Grace Harbor Church. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Eleanor Hayes, presented a methodical and emotionally restrained case. They laid out the forensic evidence with clinical precision. The gasoline residue, the burn patterns, the surveillance footage of Daniel purchasing the accelerants, and finally, his detailed confession. Each piece of evidence was presented dispassionately, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. The most anticipated testimonies were those of Pastor Arthur Vance and Sarah Vance. Pastor Arthur Vance, his public image irrevocably tarnished, took the stand looking frail, his once vibrant presence diminished. Under direct examination, he reluctantly confirmed the affair with Sarah, his voice barely audible at times. He described it as a moment of profound weakness and expressed deep regret. His testimony was brief, punctuated by long pauses and visible discomfort. When asked about Daniel's discovery of the affair, he stated that Daniel had confronted him just days before the fire, not in a rage, but with a quiet, devastating accusation. "He looked at me as if he no longer knew who I was," Arthur testified, his voice cracking. This provided the motive, clear and stark, for Daniel's subsequent actions. Sarah Vance's testimony was equally difficult. She appeared composed but distant, her answers clipped and emotionless. She confirmed the affair, acknowledging the intimate nature of the recovered communication. She described Daniel's withdrawal in the weeks leading up to the fire, but claimed she never suspected he would resort to such an extreme act. Her testimony, though factual, lacked any discernible remorse for her role in the betrayal, focusing instead on her shock and fear. The defense, led by attorney Robert Davies, attempted to paint Daniel as a victim of profound emotional distress, suffering a temporary breakdown induced by the unimaginable betrayal by his father and wife. Davies argued that Daniel's actions, while destructive, stemmed from a moment of profound psychological break, not malicious intent. He cited Daniel's previously unblemished record, his deep-seated faith, and his dedication to his family. Martha Vance, Daniel's mother, was called by the defense. Her testimony was brief and heartbreaking. She described her son as a gentle soul deeply devoted to his family and faith. She expressed her devastation at the unraveling of her family and her bewilderment at the actions of both her husband and her son. Her quiet grief resonated throughout the courtroom, a stark reminder of the innocent casualties of such betrayal. The trial proceeded with painstaking detail, each piece of evidence, each testimony, building towards the inevitable conclusion. The jury, comprised of 12 citizens, listened intently, their faces reflecting the gravity of the proceeding. The legal arguments concluded after 2 weeks of intense deliberation, and the jury retired to consider its verdict. The silence that fell over the courtroom was heavy, expectant, and filled with the weight of shattered lives. After nearly 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The air was thick with tension as Daniel Vance stood, flanked by his legal team, his eyes fixed on the jury foreman. Pastor Arthur Vance and Sarah Vance sat in the gallery, their faces etched with anxiety. Martha Vance, visibly trembling, held her breath. The foreman stood, and the verdict was read. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Vance, guilty of arson in the first degree." The word hung in the air, definitive and final. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Daniel's shoulders slumped, a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh escaping him. There was no dramatic outburst, no sudden movement, just a profound and immediate sense of resignation. The legal system had rendered its judgment, confirming the premeditated nature of his destructive act. The sentencing phase followed 2 months later. Judge Patricia Chen presided, acknowledging the complex emotional context of the case, but emphasizing the severity of the crime. "Mr. Vance," Judge Chen stated, her voice firm but tinged with a quiet solemnity, "the court recognizes the profound betrayal you suffered. However, the law cannot condone vigilante justice or the destruction of property, regardless of the emotional catalysts. Arson is a violent felony that endangers lives and causes immense damage, both physical and communal." She detailed the parameters of the sentence, citing the use of accelerants, the significant property damage, and the potential danger to firefighters and neighbors. Daniel Vance was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with 5 years to be served in confinement, and the remaining 10 years on probation. He was also ordered to pay restitution for the damages, an amount totaling over 4. When given the opportunity to speak, Daniel Vance's voice was steady, devoid of the earlier tremor. He spoke not of remorse for the fire itself, but for the profound loss of his family, for the world that had been irrevocably altered. He offered no apology to his father or Sarah, only a quiet acknowledgement of the pain that had driven him. "My life, as I knew it, burned down before the house did," he stated, his gaze meeting no one's. The courtroom remained silent, absorbing the raw, unfiltered anguish of his words. The sentencing was a legal conclusion, but it offered no true resolution to the shattered personal lives. The physical destruction of the house on Miller Drive was complete. Now the focus shifted to the enduring emotional and psychological consequences of the betrayal and the subsequent violent act. The silence that followed the judge's pronouncement was filled with the weight of multiple devastations. Years have passed since the fire on Miller Drive. The charred skeleton of the Vance home was eventually demolished, the lot cleared and sold. A new, modern residence now stands in its place. A pristine structure that offers no outward hint of the devastation it replaced. For Martha Vance, the years have been a quiet struggle. She divorced Arthur Vance, unable to reconcile with his betrayal, and has since moved away from Alpharetta, seeking solace in a different community. The bonds of family, once thought unbreakable, proved vulnerable to the corrosive power of deceit. Her grief is a private, enduring one, a shadow that follows her through the changing seasons. The loss of her home was tangible, but the loss of her family in its original form was absolute. Pastor Arthur Vance, stripped of his pastoral duties and community respect, also left Alpharetta. He moved to a small town in rural Georgia, living a solitary existence, marked by the public scandal and personal failures. His spiritual authority, once a source of comfort for many, had been irrevocably compromised. The quiet devotion he once inspired was replaced by a grim legacy of scandal and broken trust. Sarah Vance also vanished from Alpharetta, the weight of her role in the affair proving too much to bear in a community that had once welcomed her. Her path after the trial remained unknown, a testament to the isolating nature of public shame. The lives of all those directly involved were fundamentally altered, their futures redefined by the events of that summer day. Daniel Vance continues to serve his sentence. The initial anguish and quiet resignation have settled into a grim acceptance. His act, born of an unimaginable betrayal, resulted in a definitive legal consequence, but the emotional scars remain. The fire did not erase the memory of the affair. Instead, it solidified it, transforming a private pain into a public and enduring tragedy. The once vibrant family, a cornerstone of the Alpharetta community, became a stark example of how deeply hidden secrets can unravel the very fabric of existence, leaving behind only the haunting echoes of what once was. The story of Miller Drive serves as a permanent, chilling reminder of the destructive power of human betrayal and the devastating ripple effects that can shatter lives, even in the most serene and unsuspecting of suburban landscapes. The quiet devastation lingers,